The alarm never sounded. That was the first thing Sergeant Daravos noticed when the perimeter went dark. Not an explosion, not a scream, not the wail of breach protocols echoing through the stone corridors of Velshan Citadel. Just silence. The kind that swallowed everything whole and left nothing behind. She was already moving before the thought finished forming. The Coalition had stationed her here as a diplomatic observer, one human embedded with the Kethar Royal Guard as a gesture of interspecies goodwill. Symbolic, they'd called it. A handshake in uniform. She was meant to stand at attention during ceremonies, nod during briefings she could barely follow, and file monthly reports that nobody read. She was not meant to matter. The Citadel housed Queen Velshera, last surviving heir of the Kethar Empire, the single thread holding 17 star systems from open civil war. The Separatist Convergence had been hunting her for 3 years. Every assassination attempt had failed. Every infiltration had been crushed before it reached the inner walls. Until tonight. Dara rounded the corner and found the first body, a Royal Guardsman, 8 feet tall, his exoskeleton cracked at the neck joint, his compound eyes already dimming. He hadn't even drawn his lance. Whatever had hit him had come fast and quiet and without mercy. She crouched, pressed 2 fingers to the warm chitin of his thorax out of instinct, then stood. No time to mourn what she couldn't fix. The Citadel's interior was a labyrinth of curved organic architecture. The Kethar built their structures the way they built their societies, in spiraling concentric rings, each layer more fortified than the last. The Queen's chamber sat at the absolute center. To reach it from the outer ring meant passing through 9 checkpoints, 6 sealed bulkheads, and approximately 10,000 warriors arranged in rotating defensive formations that overlapped like the teeth of a gear. The Convergence hadn't come to assassinate the Queen tonight. They'd come to take her. Dara heard them before she saw them, the coordinated footfall of a military unit moving in tight formation, the hiss of suppressor tech dampening their energy signatures, the low subsonic pulse that was already making the walls vibrate. They'd knocked out the alarm grid first. Then, communications. Then, the outer rings lighting. They were professionals, and they had planned this for a long time. She had her sidearm, 40 rounds, a combat blade, and a layout of the Citadel she'd memorized out of boredom during her 3rd week of standing at attention in empty hallways. She ran toward the sound. The first checkpoint was already compromised. For Kethar guards down, a Convergence breach team moving through the sealed gate with military precision. 8 of them. Armed with pulse disruptors and kinetic suppressors designed specifically to punch through Kethar exoskeleton. Someone had done their research. Dara didn't announce herself. She came through the ventilation access panel in the ceiling, a passage the Kethar never used because their bodies were too large to fit, dropped directly into the middle of the breach team, put 2 rounds through the nearest combatant before her boots hit the floor, pivoted, used his falling body as a shield against the return fire, and moved. She was smaller than anything else in this building. That had felt like a disadvantage for 6 months. Tonight it was the only thing keeping her alive. 3 of the 8 were down before they recalibrated to her position. The other 5 spread wide, trying to flank, not yet understanding that she'd already mapped their sightlines and positioned herself in the one dead zone where all 5 of them were obstructing each other's shots. She put the 4th down with her blade, the 5th with her elbow against his throat and her knee against his weapon hand. The 6th tried to retreat and made it 2 steps before she caught him. The 7th and 8th ran. She let them run. They'd warn the others, which meant the others would stop moving forward and start forming a defensive perimeter around whatever position they'd already secured. That gave her time. She pulled a pulse disruptor from the nearest down soldier, checked its charge, 60%, and moved deeper into the Citadel. Behind her, in the distance, she heard the first Kethar war horn sound. The outer ring had finally registered the breach. 10,000 warriors were mobilizing. The problem was that the Queen was at the center, and the Convergence was already past the 3rd ring. Dara had done the math in the 30 seconds it took her to cross the checkpoint. The Royal Guard would seal every ring from the outside in, standard defensive doctrine. They would lock the bulkheads, contain the Convergence, and flood each corridor with overwhelming force. It was exactly the right response. It would also seal the Queen in with whatever Convergence unit had already reached her. No one inside those walls was going to survive the lockdown except Dara, because only Dara knew every maintenance tunnel, every ventilation shaft, every structural anomaly she'd catalogued across 6 months of restless insomnia and obsessive habit. She turned left at the second junction, dropped into the floor access panel, and started running through the dark. The maintenance tunnels smelled like old stone and machine oil, and they were never meant for anything larger than a cleaning drone. Dara moved through them on her forearms and knees, the pulse disruptor pressed flat against her chest, counting junctions in her head because there was no light down here. Left. Right. Left. Straight. Drop at the third vertical shaft. She'd measured the drop once during a maintenance inspection. 4 meters, landing on a drainage grate that would hold her weight if she absorbed the impact across both legs and didn't hesitate. She didn't hesitate. The grate held. She rolled, came up moving, and pushed through the access hatch into the 5th ring corridor. The 5th ring was chaos. Convergent soldiers were moving in organized columns, not panicking, not rushing, but advancing with the mechanical steadiness of a unit that had rehearsed this exact operation. She counted them in the span of a single breath. 40, maybe more, visible in this corridor alone. The columns extended in both directions. They weren't fighting their way through. They were flowing through, like water finding the path of least resistance, and the path of least resistance led directly to the Queen's chamber. The Kethar inner guard was holding at the 6th ring. She could hear the clash of lances against kinetic shields, the deep percussion of Kethar warriors fighting with everything they had. But the convergence had already split their force. Half were engaging the inner guard head-on to pin them. The other half were rooting around through the lower passages the inner guard couldn't follow because the passages were too narrow. Dara was the only thing that fit. She moved parallel to the convergence column rather than through it, using every doorway and structural alcove as cover. They were scanning for Kethar signatures, exoskeleton density, thermal mass, compound eye reflectivity. She registered on their sensors as essentially nothing. Background noise. At the 4th alcove, she stopped. A convergence officer stood 6 feet away with his back to her, coordinating the advance through a comms unit. He was Lethani, bipedal, 4-armed, the upper pair folded across his chest in the command posture his species used when projecting authority. His armor was marked with the 3/ insignia of a tactical coordinator. He was giving orders to the unit approaching the Queen's antechamber. She listened for 11 seconds. The convergence wasn't planning to kill the Queen. They were planning to take her alive and use her as leverage, force the 17 systems to stand down by threatening her execution on a public broadcast. They had a containment vessel already positioned at the outer wall. They had a transport waiting in low orbit. They had a timeline measured in minutes. The officer finished his transmission and started to turn. Dara moved before he completed the rotation. She came in low, inside the reach of all 4 arms, used the disruptor's casing as a striking surface against the base of his skull, caught him as he dropped, and lowered him silently to the floor. She took his comms unit. Now she knew their channel. Now she could hear every order, every position update, every countdown. 7 minutes until they reached the Queen's chamber. She pulled up the Citadel map in her head and began recalculating. The direct route to the Queen's chamber was through the 6th ring, which was currently an active combat zone. The maintenance route she'd used to reach the 5th ring didn't extend further inward. The 6th ring's tunnels had been sealed after a drainage incident 2 months ago, and she'd noted the sealed hatches and moved on. But there was one other way. The Kethar Citadel had been built over a much older structure. She'd seen the references in architectural briefings she'd read while everyone else slept. The original foundations were pre-Empire, built by a civilization whose name the Kethar didn't even use anymore. Those foundations included a ceremonial approach tunnel that ran directly from the outer wall to the heart of the Citadel, bypassing every ring, every checkpoint, every bulkhead. The Kethar had sealed it centuries ago, considered it a security vulnerability. They'd filled the entrance with a decorative stone panel in the 3rd ring's eastern gallery and apparently forgotten it existed. She'd stood in front of that panel during a cultural briefing and noticed the draft coming through the seam at its base. She'd said nothing because it hadn't seemed relevant. Now she ran. The eastern gallery was a different kind of chaos. Kethar civilians, the non-warrior inhabitants of the Citadel, were moving in organized evacuation lines, guided by a handful of guards who were keeping their composure despite the noise and fear rolling through the crowd. Dara pressed against the wall and moved against the current, invisible to the civilians because she was so much smaller than anything they were looking for. The decorative panel was exactly where she remembered. She pressed her palm flat against the stone and felt the draft, cold air from somewhere old and deep, still moving after centuries. She pressed harder. The panel shifted a centimeter. Whatever mechanism held it had corroded. It wasn't sealed so much as stuck. She put her shoulder against it and pushed with everything she had, bracing both feet against the gallery floor, and the panel ground backward with a sound like a broken joint and, then, gave way all at once. Cold air hit her face. Darkness beyond. She stepped through. The ancient tunnel was cut from raw stone, not the smooth organic curves of Cathar architecture but straight lines and sharp corners, the work of a civilization that thought in right angles. The ceiling was low enough that she had to drop her chin. The floor was uneven but dry. She moved by feel, one hand trailing the left wall, counting her steps. At 200 steps, she heard breathing ahead. She stopped. It was too deliberate to be ambient noise. Someone was in the tunnel. She pressed herself against the wall and waited, controlling her own breath, letting her eyes adjust to a darkness that stubbornly refused to offer anything useful. She counted heartbeats. 8, 12, 15. Then, a voice, speaking Cathar, low and controlled. A voice she recognized from diplomatic recordings and ceremony briefings. Queen Velshera. She was not alone. 2 other voices answered her in the clipped tones of close protection guards. The Queen had found the tunnel herself, or known about it. She was already moving through it, evacuating without waiting for her guard to breach the 6th ring. She was moving toward the outer wall, toward the convergence extraction point. Dara stepped forward and spoke in the 12 words of Cathar she had memorized specifically because they were the 12 most important. My queen. The outer wall is compromised. They are waiting for you there. Silence. The kind of silence that meant weapons were being raised in the dark. Dara kept her voice completely even. I am Sergeant Dara Voss, Coalition Observer, assigned to your Royal Guard 6 months ago. I am currently the only person in this citadel who knows you are in this tunnel and knows the outer wall is a trap. More silence. Then, the sound of a single footstep. A bioluminescent lamp flickered on, held in the lower hand of one of the Queen's guards, a massive Cathar warrior whose compound eyes caught the light and threw it back in fragments. He was looking at Dara with an expression she'd learned to read as controlled aggression. The Queen stood behind him. She was smaller than Dara had expected from the portraits. Her exoskeleton was deep blue-black with iridescent markings that shifted as she moved, and she held herself with the absolute stillness of someone who had spent a lifetime being watched and had made stillness into armor. Her 4 eyes moved across Dara in one slow assessment. The outer wall, she said in perfect Coalition standard. How many? I don't know the full count. I took their tactical coordinators' comms unit. I can give you their channel, but I can't translate fast enough. You can. A pause. 3 seconds. Dara counted them. The Queen extended one hand. Dara placed the comms unit in it. The Queen listened for 6 seconds, then spoke to her guards in rapid Cathar. Both guards shifted their posture, weapons lowering slightly, bodies angling to face back the way they'd come rather than forward. Then, the Queen looked at Dara again. They have sealed the outer wall and are moving inward through the 2nd ring. They have been tracking my biometric signature. Her voice was perfectly measured. Not calm. Dara understood the difference now. Controlled. Chosen calm. Which means staying in this tunnel will not protect me. They will find this entrance within 4 minutes. Yes, Dara said. So we go back through the citadel. Yes. Through the convergence force. Through the part of it that isn't expecting us to come at them from inside their perimeter. The Queen studied her. You are the human observer, she said. You were assigned to stand at ceremonies. I was bored, Dara said. I memorized the building. Something moved through the Queen's expression. Not a smile. Cathar faces didn't arrange themselves that way. But something adjacent. A recalibration. Then, lead, she said. Dara turned and moved back through the tunnel. The first convergence soldier they encountered was alone, a rigard posted at the eastern gallery entrance, watching for movement from the direction Dara had come. He was watching the wrong direction entirely when she came out of the panel behind him. The Queen's guards moved with a speed that still surprised her even now. The soldier was down before she had finished stepping through the gap. They moved through the gallery in formation, the Queen at center, both guards bracketing her, Dara 2 steps ahead acting as point. She was reading the convergence comms unit as she moved, listening to position updates she couldn't fully understand but catching the cadence of tactical communication, short bursts, acknowledgements, the specific tone shift that meant something unexpected. At the second burst, she held up a fist. Everyone stopped. She held the comms unit to her ear and listened to the burst again, parsing what she could. The tactical coordinator she'd taken down had been found. They knew she was in the building. They knew she had the comms unit. She switched the unit off. Now she was flying blind. So were they, but they outnumbered her by an order of magnitude in a building they'd spent months planning to navigate. "We need a different route," she said quietly. "The throne corridor," the Queen said immediately. "There is a secondary lance storage access that connects to the outer guard barracks. My guard will know to rally there." It was one corridor Dara hadn't memorized. She said so without flinching. "Then, I will lead," the Queen said, and moved to the front of the formation. Dara let her, repositioned herself to cover the rear, and followed. The Queen moved through her own citadel like water returning to its channel. Not fast but absolutely certain, each turn taken without hesitation, each doorway assessed and cleared before she passed through it. Her guards mirrored her movement with the synchronicity of people who had drilled together for years. Dara matched their pace and watched the corridors behind them and thought about the geometry of what they were doing. The convergence was searching inward. They were moving outward. That was the one advantage. Every second the search focused on the center was another meter of distance between the Queen and their containment vessel. At the fifth corridor junction, they ran out of distance. 8 convergent soldiers stepped around the corner ahead, not moving quickly, moving carefully, the way soldiers moved when they were sure they had their target cornered. One of them raised a hand. "Halt!" The Queen's 2 guards stepped forward simultaneously without a word. What followed lasted 11 seconds and Dara watched most of it from the rear, managing the 2 soldiers who broke from the group to flank around the corridor's edge, handling the first with a blade and the second with the disruptor at point-blank range, the impact loud enough to make her ears ring. Then, it was quiet again. All 8 were down. One of the Queen's guards was injured, a kinetic hit across his left flank, the exoskeleton cracked, fluid leaking at the joint. He was still standing. Still functional. But slower. The Queen looked at him once. He met her gaze and straightened. They kept moving. The throne corridor opened before them like a held breath, long and wide, lit by bioluminescent panels that pulsed in the deep blue frequency the Kethar used for high-security spaces. At the far end, the massive arch of the outer guard barracks entrance stood sealed. Standing in front of it were 11 convergent soldiers and, behind them, positioned with the specific stillness of someone who had planned every moment of this night, was a figure in command armor, the mission leader, not the coordinator Dara had taken down earlier, but someone else. Higher rank. The 3/ insignia on the coordinator had been silver. This figure's insignia was gold. The mission commander had anticipated the throne corridor. He raised his weapon, not at the Queen, but at Dara. "Sergeant Voss," he said. His coalition standard was perfect, unaccented, the kind of fluency that came from years of intelligence work. "You have been remarkably inconvenient." Dara didn't move. "The Queen," he said, "will come with us. The remaining guard will stand down. And you," he tilted his head, a gesture that on his species meant something she couldn't read, "will finally do what you were assigned to do. Stand still and observe." The Queen said nothing. The 2 guards held their positions. Dara felt the geometry of the corridor with the same part of her mind that had memorized building layouts and maintenance schedules and the draft coming through a sealed panel. 11 soldiers plus 1 commander. 2 guards. 1 injured. 1 Queen. 1 human with a half-charged disruptor and a blade. The commander was watching her because she was the unknown. The piece that hadn't fit his plan from the moment she dropped into that first checkpoint and started moving. She let him watch her. She stayed absolutely still, both hands visible, the disruptor held loosely, non-threatening. She watched his posture. Watched the moment his attention shifted, just slightly, just for a fraction of a second, to the Queen, because the Queen had begun to step forward and that was the thing his entire plan depended on, the Queen's cooperation or the Queen's capture, and his eyes moved to track it. In the fraction of that second, Dara's arm came up. She didn't shoot the commander. She shot the bioluminescent panel array directly above the convergence formation. the corridor went black. In the darkness, three things happened almost simultaneously. The Queen's injured guard hit the floor and pulled a manual override from his armor's emergency kit, a device that sent a single hardwired signal through the Citadel's mechanical systems, bypassing every electronic lockout, triggering every barracks door in the building to open from the inside. The barracks door at the end of the corridor detonated open in a cascade of emergency light and, rushing bodies, Ketha Royal Guard, dozens of them, pouring through with lancers already active. And Dara reached the commander in the dark, by memory and geometry and the sound of his breathing, and put the disruptor against his armor at the exact joint she'd identified during the 11 seconds she'd stood still letting him watch her. She pulled the trigger once. He dropped. The corridor flooded with light from the guard's lamps and the sound of a battle that lasted, from that point, less than 90 seconds. When it ended, the throne corridor was held. The Queen stood at its center, uninjured, surrounded by her reformed guard, and looked at Dara across a floor that told the full story of the night in the only language that didn't need translation. The silence stretched. Then, the Queen spoke, not in Cathar, but in Coalition Standard, so that there would be no question of meaning and no ambiguity in the record that every guard in that corridor would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Sergeant Voss was not assigned here to stand at ceremonies, she said. She was assigned here because the universe has a habit of putting the right person in the right building at the right moment. A pause. Measured. Chosen. I intend to ensure that the Coalition understands what that is worth. Dara lowered her weapon. She had 42 rounds at the start of the night. She had 7 left. She had walked through 10,000 warriors and a network of tunnels cut by a civilization no one remembered and a darkness so complete she had navigated it by counting her own heartbeats. She had not stood still. She had not observed. She stood in the throne corridor of Velshan's citadel with 7 rounds and a borrowed blade and looked at the Queen of 17 star systems. And the Queen looked back at her with 4 eyes that had spent a lifetime learning to see what mattered. And neither of them needed to say another word. The war horns of the Royal Guard rose through the citadel in waves, each one deeper and louder than the last, until the sound was less like music and more like a verdict. And the night, which had begun without an alarm, ended with the kind of noise that leaves no room for silence at all.